Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Amma ba'du fa'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu qu anfusakum wa ahlikum naran wa quduha an-nas wal hijara 'alayha malaa'ikatun ghiladun shidadun la ya'suna Allaha ma amarahum wa yaf'aluna ma yu'marun. Sadaqallahul Azim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Subhanaka la ilma lana illa ma 'allamtana innaka antal alimul hakim. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina Maulana Muhammad wa ala ali sayyidina Maulana Muhammad wa barik wa sallim. We continue in today's session from our last session, in which we discussed the responsibility of parents, responsible parenting, and we talked very generally about this important obligation which Allah Azza wa Jal has placed upon us as parents. Today I want to speak specifically about one period of development, one age group, and about the relationship from both sides, the relationship of parents with their adolescent children and the relationship of adolescent children with their parents. Now, we can approach this from so many different angles, and even before we begin to sort of venture on this discussion, one of the things I'd like to say is that sometimes what happens is that parents base their outlook on this subject, especially when problems arise, on their perception of entitlement as parents. And that can only work if there has been a positive relation from the outset. And what do I mean by this? The key word here is entitlement. We actually see this same word coming up when we have marital problems. And I think this is a fine example to illustrate. So if the husband is unhappy with his wife, he will talk of entitlement. Oftentimes, he will say, I'm entitled to certain rights, certain obligations upon my wife. But he will neglect and abandon his responsibilities towards her in that moment. So when there are problems, it becomes an issue of entitlement. Likewise, if a wife is unhappy with her husband, there is discord between the two, then she talks of entitlement. My husband ought not to do this, ought not to behave like this. And she'll talk of her rights. And perhaps she may forget her obligations. Even though for both of the two, the couple, this is a two-way street. Both have rights and both have obligations, and you can only complete the picture, the jigsaw, and you can only have the perfect marriage when you look at both aspects, your rights and your obligations. If you are fully honoring your own obligations and you are demanding your rights, then it makes sense. And of course it is often the case that a person is fully fulfilling their obligations and they are not receiving their rights. But it is also often the case that a person is demanding their rights but they're not fulfilling their own obligations. So this idea of entitlement, this is to be seen in the parental relationship as well. A parent considers themselves entitled to respect and reverence from their children, and indeed they are. But they are also obliged to fulfill their responsibilities towards their children as well. And if they have continued to do that, then they might hope and expect that what their entitlement is may be fulfilled. But oftentimes those responsibilities are not fulfilled in the way that they should. So the entitlement element, it cannot be expected. Now I'm going to go on a tangent here to further illustrate this point, because the reason I've started with this whole point of entitlement is because I see this as one of the fundamental reasons that we are where we are. There are many other dimensions, particularly with parenting, but this particular aspect, I want to focus on it to make it very clear. So I'm going to give a completely different type of example. In Surah Al-Mutaffifin, Allah Azza wa Jal talks about traders, and He talks about a particular type of traders, Al-Mutaffifin. Tatfif means to give less than you are obliged to in a transaction. So, Wailul lil Mutaffifin, Wail is translated variously. It's the name of a valley in Jahannam, and it also means destruction. So, woe to those who give less than their obligation. This is one explanation, one translation. Another is, Wail is for those who give less than they are obliged to do so. So, who are these? The Quran explains, Wailul lil Mutaffifin, الَّذِينَ إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ يَسْتَوْفُونَ. Those that when they have a measure, something measured out for them from people, they take the full measure, يَسْتَوْفُونَ. So this is when you go to a trader and you make a purchase and you ask for a kilo of rice or apples, and you ensure that you get the full amount of potatoes, carrots, apples, rice, whatever it may be. So you ensure, your eyes are on the needle, and you are particular about ensuring that you get your full amount. And I've given a simple example, it applies to everything. Anything that you may buy, whether it's something you wear or use or you eat. So as a buyer, you ensure that you are given your full right. You complain to the company, to the seller, if there's any defect. You expect a perfect deal. Yastawfun. So these are people who are very particular about taking their full right. Yastawfun. They take the full amount from the word wafa. Yastawfun. Full amount. To take it to the full measure. الَّذِينَ إِذَا اكْتَالُوا عَلَى النَّاسِ. When they have others measuring for them, they ensure that they get their full amount. They won't tolerate the slightest shortage, slightest amount which they are entitled to. They won't let it off. They won't let anybody off the hook. They will ensure that they get it. وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ. But when they themselves measure for them or weigh for them, وَإِذَا كَالُوهُمْ أَوْ وَزَنُوهُمْ يُخْسِرُونَ. They give less than they ought to. They give less. Now Allah Ta'ala, He gives a warning. He says, أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ. Do these people not think that they are going to be raised up and resurrected? When? لِيَوْمٍ عَظِيمٍ. On a great day. يَوْمَ يَقُومُ النَّاسُ لِرَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. The day upon which people will stand before the Lord of the worlds. So Allah is reminding us of Qiyamah. Now the interesting thing in these verses is that the people who have been criticized, they have two attributes. One is that they take their own full measure, and the other is that they give less to others. Now you are entitled to your own full amount, and you can complain. It's your legal and shari'i right. So when someone gives you less, you can complain. So the criticism here is not that they want to take the full amount that they're entitled to. This isn't the criticism. If you look at this carefully, the criticism is they don't treat others the way they would be treated themselves. Though they want the full amount for themselves, they are unwilling to give that full amount to the next person. Now this metaphor of this personality trait of being unfair in a bilateral relationship where you want your full right yourself, but you're unwilling to give the full right to the other person. This is what's being criticized in the Quran, and with severe words. أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ. We're starting off with وَيْلٌ لِلْمُطَفِّفِينَ, and then أَلَا يَظُنُّ أُولَٰئِكَ أَنَّهُمْ مَبْعُوثُونَ. Do these people not believe that they will have to stand before the Creator? So in this relationship as well, because we are focusing on parents in particular, although there's benefit for both in this gathering, in this discussion, this virtual gathering inshallah, because we're focusing on parents, we need to look at and zone in on the responsibility of parents. Were I talking to children, I would have a different message. I would say to children, are we fulfilling our responsibility towards our parents? Are we showing reverence and respect to our parents and honoring them the way we should? But today's discussion is about parenting. So I say to parents, as parents, are we fulfilling our obligation? Are we asking ourselves this question? So when we don't fulfill our responsibility as parents, but we expect the children to treat us in the way that we would want to be treated, then this is the same problem. It's a one-way situation. Now, there's no justification for young people to dishonor their parents because the parents aren't treating them well, but it applies from the other side as well. So parents have to look at this situation, this question. And what am I talking about here? Now, parents sometimes think that merely being the parents of a child is sufficient in terms of fulfillment of responsibility, in terms of entitlement. Because you happen to be the parent of this child, this son or daughter, therefore it follows that everything's okay, even though you are neglecting your obligations. And as for your obligations, we could, broadly speaking, at different levels of development, divide them into two parts. There are the physical obligations and there are the spiritual obligations. In Arabic, the word is tarbiyah. And tarbiyah is when you raise somebody up and you nourish them, you nurture them. Perhaps nurture is an appropriate word to encapsulate key aspects of tarbiyah. So you help them in their upbringing and support them. For those of you who were with us last session, I gave the example of a tree and a stake, and I mentioned that, interestingly, there are two opinions about whether you should stake a tree or not. One opinion is that you should, because the sapling is going to be too weak to withstand the heavy winds, the strong winds. It may snap. And the other is that if you keep it staked for too long, it will never, when it sways with the wind, it develops resistance and flexibility, and it grows roots to resist those winds, and it becomes a strong tree. So perhaps a moderate approach is that you stake the tree initially for the period of time that it's very weak, but you give some leeway. And this is an appropriate way. When trees are actually staked, what happens is any person who does this in a sensible way, they will leave some leeway. The bit that they wrap around will not sort of restrict the tree in its growth or in its movement beyond necessity. And then eventually the stake will be pulled out and removed, and the tree will be left on its own, and it will be able to stand on its own feet. Now, we could use this example for parenting because of a number of reasons. In Quran, in Hadith, the example of a tree is used for the mu'min. So this is one aspect. The mu'min is compared to the date palm, which has firm roots and it gives fruit constantly. It has its branches in the sky. The palm leaves are in the sky, high up. And so this is one reason why we can give this example. And you have to feed a tree. You have to water the tree. You have to protect the tree from disease and from pests and from attack and so forth. But the other reason is, and this is an interesting point. See, in Arabic, the word for civilization, we use it in Urdu as well, is tahdib. And one who is muhaddab is civilized. But what does the word tahdib mean? The word is used in literature as well, in books, in reference books. If there's an extensive reference book which has been written with lots of detail, and then it is summarized and organized and codified, this codification of a large work is called tahdib. And there are many books with this title, tahdib of this and tahdib of this and tahdib of this. Where does the word come from? What's the root? The root of the word tahdib in Arabic is when you prune a tree. When you prune a tree, what happens is, if you look at a tree that's growing in the wild, then the branches all overlap and you don't have an open crest. And so what happens? The light doesn't come in easily, it's gnarled and twisted, and the fruits don't form properly, and it may be leaning onto one side. But what happens is, when a tree is being looked after by a person who has expertise in the field, what will they do? They'll know where to make the cuts, and they'll snip away growth in the middle of at the end of the summer and during parts of the winter, and by doing so, the tree will develop in a particular way, and it will be balanced. It will have an open crest, and it will have a particular shape. Now, this tahzib, done recklessly by a person who doesn't know, will damage the tree. Done sensibly, it will help the tree to develop. And even though in the short term it appears to be very brutal, people find it difficult to prune a tree when they're not sure what to do. They find that it's extensive because large proportions are just lopped off. Now, what happens? How is this relevant to a human being? It's relevant to a human being because as human beings, our characteristic and our traits as human beings, as we grow and develop, our habits form in all sorts of random directions. We can develop all sorts of personal habits. which, if not cultured and snipped, if you're right, nipped in the bud at the right time by the parent, by advice, by support, by education, by dialogue, then what will happen is we will not grow up to our full potential. And so a young person who's been neglected and they've not been given guidance will not know how to respond. And to give you one particular example is our emotional development. Now, young people often lack what is referred to as emotional intelligence. So, particularly in an era in which perhaps with busy lifestyles, when parents are working, they don't have much time for their children, and children are preoccupied with computer games and social media, a consequence can be, and not a lot of direct interaction with family members, with people in their circles. So their communication is mainly with their friends. The consequence is to be able to articulate their feelings and emotions is lost. And this is manifest when those young adolescents become adults, and they then go into a relationship, they become married, they have their own families, and they lack the ability and the confidence to express themselves in a way which is meaningful and which is helpful, shall we say, in maintaining the relationship between the couple, the husband and the wife. This goes back to the childhood and the adolescence. That relationship, that communication, that emotional intelligence isn't there with parents. It's not been developed while under the care of the parents. That communication wasn't there. And the consequence is that you have very poor relationships afterwards. Now, on this point, now let's look at this area for a while. Let's briefly look at this area. Let's go in a different direction now. Let's take the example of a person who has some emotional problems, some personal problems, and they sit for counseling. They see a counselor, they see a therapist, they see a psychiatrist. What happens? They are encouraged to open up and express their feelings, and they are assisted and guided in expressing their feelings so that they can let their feelings out and they can exchange their feelings. And when they can find words to describe their feelings, and when they can talk about it to somebody, often that's half the battle won. They feel lighter, they feel happier, and their emotional and distress and suffering can be alleviated. And it also gives a basis for advice. So the other person, if they are sensible in the way that they approach this, they can give advice to this person. Now, this task really is meant to be natural for parents. And so we come back to the starting point. Physical and spiritual tarbiyah. We're not just talking here about parents washing the child. Every parent will change the nappies of their child. Every parent will bathe the child, will feed the child. This is normal. Parents who are cruel to their children, physical cruelty is not the norm. This is not normal human nature. So any decent, balanced human being will naturally, through their parental compassion, which Allah places into the heart of a human being and into animals as well, will take care of their children. So we're not talking about this aspect of parenting alone. It's not sufficient. We're not fulfilling our responsibility if we wash our children and bathe them and we clothe them, and then as they grow older we buy them toys and pay for their necessities. That's not sufficient. That's an important part. It's not sufficient. There's much more to it than this, and this is the mistake. A lot of parents will go all out in buying nice shoes and clothes and toys for their children, by taking them on holiday, by paying for a private education perhaps, or for tutoring. So they will invest in their children in this particular aspect, but the relationship still won't be there. And I don't think I'll be missing the mark here at all if I say that sometimes, if not all the time, the personal relationship is of far more value to young people than the money that's thrown at them. The more you give them, the more they'll want. You will give them a habit of consuming. So this is not a solution. Of course parents spend on their children, and of course they should. That's appropriate. But it's not parenting This is not real parenting. This is what everybody does. If you want to be sort of an award-winning parent, and we're talking here in terms of deen, you want to be a parent who is successful. And when you are successful as a parent in deen, you are also successful in your dunya. Because what will happen is when you invest in your child and you raise them according to the teachings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, you get payback in the dunya as well. Those children will become a source of happiness for you in the dunya. And when they prosper, it's not just about their relationship with you. When you see them prospering, your own flesh and blood, it will make you happy. It will give you happiness. And it will be a source of reward for you. And it will be a source of honor for you as well in this dunya. And when you leave this dunya, it will be a sadaqah jariyah for you when you go into your grave. So now, what is expected of parents? Now, we can go through a list and there's lots of detail. Let's talk about adolescence in particular, and I'll come back to the point which I've just been elaborating on, right? Or 2 points, shall we say. The one was, this idea of entitlement can only be realized if you yourself have invested in your children. If you've neglected your responsibility and you haven't developed that relationship, then perhaps the question of entitlement is in the air. It's not, how can you expect your children to treat you the way they ought to treat you when you haven't brought them up to understand this? So this is one aspect, and the other is about this relationship. It's about this relationship. So in fact, I think we can go through a list here, which will nicely summarize some aspects. So let's start from a little earlier. When the child comes into the dunya, how do you receive the child? You receive the child with the adhan, Allahu Akbar, in the adhan in the right ear, and the iqamah in the left ear. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. This is the first da'wah. So gently, you say the adhan in the right ear of the newborn, and then you say the iqamah in the left ear. And then there's the tahniq. The tahniq is a beautiful sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which a date or something similar is chewed. The Prophet ﷺ, the Sahaba would bring their child to be blessed to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ would chew something like a date, and on occasion it would be a date, and he would place this chewed date into the mouth, a small amount, into the mouth of the child. It's normally just gently placed onto the palate of the child, a tiny amount, and this is then ingested by the child. This has been done for centuries in Islam, and it's a source of barakah, because the saliva of the pious person you take your child to is ingested by the child, and you do this in the hope that some of those aspects and some of that barakah will go into that child, inshallah. So the first is the adhan, in which there's a da'wah, and the second, there's an invitation towards Allah and His Rasul. In the dua which Rasulullah taught us, what did he describe the dua as? The adhan as, Allahumma rabba hadhihi da'wati tamma. O Allah, Rabb of this complete invitation. The adhan is a complete invitation. So this is what you're giving the child on their first entrance into this dunya. That's how you welcome them. Hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah. And then this tahniq, another sunnah. And then what happens is the naming of the child, giving the child a pious name. And then the first thing that you teach your child, iftahu awwala kalimatin bila ilaha illallah. The first thing that you ought to teach the child to say is la ilaha illallah. And then moving on, the child should be raised on halal rizq, and the child should be taught their obligation towards Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and towards the creation from the early years. You teach them their istinja and tahara. Toilet training is important, and we're not talking about how to sit on the potty here alone. We're also talking about when the child is capable of washing, because without proper istinja, personal purification, wiping first and then washing. Now you might think, why am I talking about this? There are any number of adults in our communities who don't know how to do istinja properly because their parents didn't teach them when they were small. It wasn't formed as a habit, and so even if they do wudu, the wudu won't be valid because they don't know how to do istinja properly. This is something which is part of parenting. So then the child grows older. There are other details, but we're talking about wudu and tahara. We're talking about in encouraging our children to perform salah from the age of 7 until they have a permanent habit at the age of 10. This is before bulugh, before balagh, before they've reached the age of puberty. Now, it's interesting, some parents like to encourage their very small children to perform salah. Now, if you're performing salah, if mom and dad are performing salah, and the 5-year-old likes to join, that's fine. But this isn't the age. This is the age in which the deen is not saying that they have to perform salah. Let them play. Teach them salah, so they're ready for it, but let them play. But when they are 7, then start encouraging them. And you've got 3 years to encourage them. And so by the age of 10, they're in the habit of salah. Now, this is what we're supposed to do. So now, you can, at the age of 10 till the age of puberty, this is when you reaffirm that established habit. Sadly, it's a very small minority of Muslims who grow up with their parents encouraging them to perform salah during the age when they should be. And then it becomes difficult later on when they enter the age of puberty. And the reality is that to miss one single salah intentionally is a kabira guna, it's a major sin. So what's happening is when young people are not in the habit of performing salah, then they go into the age of puberty missing prayers until they themselves come to the realization. You know, it's the heart, isn't it? It's the iman. They realize that, subhanAllah, I should be performing salah, and then they start practicing. So then they have to make up for those 2-3 years, which is difficult for them. And this is the neglect of the parents. It's because the parents think they're too young when they're not too young. And this problem of this attitude of being too young, unfortunately, this has other consequences as well. When parents neglect talking about many issues to their children on time, the consequence of this is when the time comes, it's too late. So, salah. So, what happens is when we talk about our aqaid, our beliefs, our salah, our zakah, our sawm, our hajj, this habit forming up to the age of puberty applies to salah, it applies to sawm as well. And children should know their obligations. So really it's about all aspects of Islam. All aspects of Islam. You know, sometimes when I want to summarize life in an Islamic household, I simply give the example of the 5 pillars, literally, because sometimes people think this is detached from day-to-day life. It's not. The household, the Islamic household, the central pillar in family life too, is La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah. And it's the 5 times daily salah, it's the fasting of Ramadan, it's hajj when it's fard, and when it's possible then perhaps umrah, and it's giving the zakah. And giving the zakah is not just a parental responsibility. Children should be encouraged to give sadaqah with their hands. When you give something in sadaqah and it passes through many hands, everybody gets the full reward. In reverse order, in a contract, in a ribawi contract in which there's riba, everybody is implicated. Whoever participates in the contract, whoever writes it, takes it, gives it, everybody's implicated. It's the same with the serving of alcohol and wine. Everybody is implicated. The person who prepares it, who pours it, who serves it, who drinks it, all are implicated. On the opposite side of the spectrum, everybody who participates in the donation and the distribution of sadaqah gets the reward. And this is why often the mashayikh would ensure that other people be involved. So if you give some money to your spouse to give in sadaqah, it's your money, you're giving it to your spouse to give in sadaqah. When you pass it through their hand, you both get the reward. And when a khadim does this, an attendant, a servant, an assistant, they get the reward too. So involve your children. So when you want to give some sadaqah, and it's not just about zakat. You know, today what happens in the world is organizations suffer, and this is a general point. I'm very tentative about talking about charity because people assume that when mullahs talk about charity, they want charity. I'm not asking for charity, I'm mentioning the point here. Okay, but the point is, people only give zakat. Many people give a lot of charity, but many people only give zakat. And the consequence is that when there's an opportunity to spend on something great, think, oh, it's not zakat, so okay. If you want zakat, then bismillah. So organizations that don't do that kind of work in which zakat can be expended, suffer because people don't want to give other types of charity. Well, Allah Ta'ala is only asking you for the 1/40th part of your total surplus income. The other 39 parts, people like Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq give his whole amount. Umar gives half on the occasion of Tabuk. This was normal in the Sahaba to give large amounts just like that at the drop of a hat. So the point here is encourage your children to give sadaqah so that it becomes easier for them to give zakat when the time comes, and they should be doing this during their adolescent years. Now, I've wandered broad and far, wide and far, but let me come back. Let me just come back and summarize a few points, and then we can, inshallah, take some of your questions. So let me just come back. When we talk about tarbiyah and nurturing young people, I think a lot of this, not together with formal education and reading and discussion, it's based on the ability of parents and children, young people, to communicate. And now I'm going to go through a list. Some of the things which I feel in this day and age are our obligation as parents. We must discuss relationships. We must discuss relationships with our children, even though we may find it embarrassing. And we must make it possible for them. Now, we're not suggesting a father shouldn't really be discussing menstruation with his daughter. It shouldn't be necessary. The way you do this, the way our Salaf would do this, is when you come to that chapter of the book, then you leave that chapter to the child to read. I've had this personal experience where children pick up what we put in the house for them to read on any subject. Sometimes my children have told me about aspects of Islam which has surprised me. Where did you learn that? Dad, we saw it in this book which was on the shelf. Subhanallah. So they found their own way to it. And so you can do this with these embarrassing subjects as well. And you can ask them to read that chapter when it's necessary. So when we're talking about relationships and tahara aspects, which are when a young boy is reaching the age of puberty and it's going to become farz for him to do ghusl, if neither the mother nor the father can speak to that young person, then they should give him something to read and then ask him to read it. Ask him to read it. Spend on that. And the young people should not be reduced to having to Google this information from sources which you don't even know the reliability of. And so similarly, we ought to talk to our young people about relationships in Islam and the context of who you can marry and whom you cannot marry, and how when the time comes it will be something that, you know, if the children have no, if you have never, I'm sorry, but you know, this subject, we have young people any given week or month of the year, we come across cases where a brother, a sister is 28, 35, 42, 39, and you ask, you know, they're worried, say preshan, they're worried, they're sad, they're looking for a partner. You say, what happened? And so you ask them, say, has your family not assisted you? No, they're not interested. You have young people who are just ready to go. They have a match as well. The parents want them to marry relating to their own choice, but when the appropriate match hasn't been found by the parents and the young people find permissible matches, then what happens? The parents reject this. This leads to its own consequences. This is a subject for another day. Right now, what I'm saying is adolescents should be talked to about relationships. And it's not about what dad and mum says goes. It's what, as if you're saying this as a Muslim, son, daughter, this is what Allah and His Rasul say. This is what Allah and His Rasul say. And so what is permissible for you, what is not permissible for you, what can you do, what you shouldn't you do. Then the subject of drugs and substance abuse and drinking and alcohol, this subject needs to be discussed by parents and young people. It's absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial. And I've been talking quite a lot recently about cannabis and marijuana and weed. It's because it's very common. It's very common and it's very easily available. And it's not just a casual, it's not just the fact that it's a sin. It's not, and by definition, this is something across the ummah for centuries. Cannabis has been used, marijuana, bunj it's called in Arabic, bang and bang, various words are used for it, grassweed. This has been used for centuries, for some 7 centuries it's been used by human beings. And the fatwas of the ummah across the world, from the Arab world to the Asian world to the madhahib, everybody agrees that it's not permitted. It's a sin, it's haram. So when we don't even tell our children this, so it's not just about the fact that people will waste money and it will have an impact on their mind, it can cause schizophrenia. Many young people think they have a jinn inside them because of psychological problems as a consequence of taking drugs. When you've never ever talked about this subject, you know, la haya fil Islam, there's a level of haya which is appropriate, a type of haya. which is appropriate and is part of Iman. But the kind of haya which prevents you from saying what is your obligation and your fard and wajib as a parent, that's not the kind of haya which you'll be rewarded for. You may be punished for not speaking out and talking to your children when you were supposed to. So these are just some key points. I can hardly do justice in a session this short, but I hope if we've gathered nothing else, I think one of the things which we've talked about here is the importance of being involved with our young people beyond their clothes, beyond their food, about helping them to express themselves, about discussing topical issues with them, and helping them develop in their emotional intelligence so that they're more capable of facing tomorrow's world. Ji.
Mullah Sahib, we've got a number of questions, so
Ji.
inshallah we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Ji.
First question from a sister. My question is how to practice patience and motivation while facing challenges from children and from life.
How to practice patience and motivation while facing challenges from children and life. Okay, so let's just break the question up. Patience and motivation and children and life. So patience is part and parcel of any Muslim's life. As human beings, we are all vulnerable. We can all feel weak, and we are particularly weak when we are drained, when we are tired, when we are doing more than a single person's work. Now parenting is really for mum and dad, both have their role. One has to sometimes be the good cop and the other the bad cop. So when dad tells the child off, then mum has to be there, and vice versa. It's something which has to be done together, and parents should be conferring with one another. But nevertheless, parenting is challenging. So if we talk about the first point, let us acknowledge that we will not always be up to, we'll not always be full of energy, we'll not always be performing the way we want to. Having said this, we have to do our best. And we were talking here about patience and motivation. There's another way of looking at this. We feel drained because, it's a repetition, it's the mental narrative in our heads when something goes wrong, and we think, here we go again, this kind of attitude, this repetitive cycle. The narrative in our minds should be positive. And part of the solution here is you can actually replace sabr with shukr in any situation if you have the inner strength to do this, which you can try to practice and develop. Sabr and shukr come together. But shukr is greater than sabr. The ulama say shukr is greater than sabr. And the ultimate status is shukr. So sabr is actually a door to shukr. So and I'll explain how this works briefly. See, what it is, when a problem comes to us, we are encouraged to be patient. But what if we see the benefits, the positives in that problem, the silver lining, if you like, then you start seeing it as a ni'mat. If I have a fever because of an infection, the fever is a positive because the fever is helping me to fight the illness. There's often a positive where you see a negative. If you can see the positive, and you can see the rahmat as a consequence, Allah, the hope for reward, for example, the dunyawi and ukhrawi benefits, the dini, dunyawi, ukhrawi, you can start seeing something as a ni'mah. Now when it comes to children, and perhaps life generally, when you start realizing that children are a ni'mah from Allah, at least my child is not this. If my child is agitated, difficult to manage, then at least they're not something else which might be worse. And you can think of all sorts of things. They may be physically healthy, that's a ni'mat. If they are physically ill, then they may not have an illness which is more severe than the one they have, and other people's children may have those illnesses. If similarly, if we're talking about on a spiritual level, if there's some negative aspect, there may be some positive aspect. We need to acknowledge the positive aspects and see the children as a ni'mah. When we do this, then this will excite the desire to do shukr, and this will give us more energy. And this is an approach to life as well. So it's not a comprehensive answer. I hope it's part of the answer. If we start seeing the positives and we start realizing that when we invest time and effort and energy into those children, Allah will give us ajr. We're doing it to please Allah Ta'ala. And remember also, and I'll finish with this point in answer to this particular question, when you talk to your children and give them advice and nasiha, and they don't always appear to be listening, remember, sometimes you're still planting a seed deep down in their heart, and that seed may come to fruition later. So just wait for it and support it with your du'as, the seed that you're planting. Ji.
what right does a mother or parent have on their children's income? Second part.
Okay.
I am finding it difficult to manage finances at home, but feel embarrassed to ask my children who are earning.
What rights do parents have over their children's income? First part. And the second, I'm struggling with my finances at home and I'm embarrassed to ask my children. Right. Relating to the first part, it's about the age of your children. If your children have come of age, if they have not come of age, then the Prophet ﷺ said in this hadith, "Anta wa maluka li abika," you and your wealth are your father's. So if a parent takes their children's property, in Islam this is, without their permission, your own children, it's actually yours to begin with. Does it mean that you can't give something to your children? Does it mean that it's not appropriate to be sensitive in the way you do this and use wisdom? But in principle, it is permissible for you. And there are examples. Parents always exercise their parental right in this respect, in the sense that if someone gives your child a whole box of chocolates, you won't allow them to eat it in one go because it won't be good for their health and their teeth. So what will you do? You may give them part of it, or so this is similarly. So there are similar examples. You can what your child has is really yours anyway as a parent. When they come of age, then too that right is there, but it doesn't mean that the parent shouldn't be sensitive to the needs of the child. So this does mean that on the one hand, parents can ask for that assistance. It also means that children should be aware of this responsibility. It goes back to my earlier point. This is about an education. It's about an education. Young people need to be brought up understanding that there's a financial obligation to their parents. When is it a wajib for the children? See, there's 2 points. One is that parents can ask their children to support them. So if your children don't understand this point, it's your entitlement to ask them for that support if you need it. That's valid. Children of themselves need to be aware. There's 2 situations. If your parents are not financially needy, then what you give them is optional. If they are financially needy, then they are, and you are able to spend on them, then they are part of your iyal. This means they're part of your financial dependence. So in addition to your own wife and children, as a father, for example, it is your wajib and obligation to spend on your parents, and you're not doing them a favor. Now, the problem in this kind of situation is it's appropriate for the mother to know, the father to know that there's an entitlement there. But if the young person doesn't know this, then the only thing that can be done is that the parents need to say this to their children. You need to contribute to the pot if you're living here. But if young people were to know this obligation themselves and fulfill it, then it would be easier for the parents. But the obligation is there when there's a need, when the parents have a need. When the parents don't have a need, the young person is not obliged to spend by themselves. They're not obliged by themselves to spend. Now, there are other aspects to this, and I'll allude to this briefly. If your son, for example, is himself married and he has his own children, then the parents too need to be sensitive to the needs of his own family as well. Because in some situations, parents forget this. We have examples in Asian communities of family businesses where your son is working and he has his own life and family, and you're giving him spending money. There are situations like that quite often in our community, which is also insensitive. So there's a balance to be struck. G.
How can we keep our kids connected to the mosque in teenage years when often they don't attend Jummah due to school?
How can we keep our teenage children connected to the mosque in teenage years when often they don't attend Jummah due to school? This is the school aspect I'll deal with first. Parents should engage with schools in a constructive and positive way. In a constructive and positive way, which means this is not about being the way you talk to staff in a school, the teachers of your children, or to senior staff in your local school, should be appropriate. You should have a positive relationship with them. You should request time if you need to, exchange emails. So in a positive way, in a constructive way, liaise with staff and find ways that the children can conduct their Jummah prayer during lunch breaks and break times, or go to a nearby facility. This is already happening in many secondary schools. Sometimes young people find this easy to do because there's a culture in their school of performing salah. In some schools though, the children find themselves to be a minority and they don't have the courage or the confidence to address this issue themselves, and they need support. So this is with reference to Jummah at school, and this facility can easily be provided in a classroom, and many schools do. But it's about that dialogue, that discussion with schools. Outside of school, the connection with the masjid is not just about Jummah. And yes, I too grieve over the fact that we see elderly people in the masjids, and we see very young people who come for Quran classes, but the adolescents are to be found in small numbers. I think one of the reasons for this is that fathers they are more concerned about their own salah, frankly, than they are about the salah of their sons. And I think it's the parental responsibility. Parents need to encourage their children to go to the masjid. In our neighborhood, I was very encouraged when I saw some young children would be playing football on the street, and then they would automatically go cross a few roads and come into the masjid and perform salah. And I was very pleased to see it. To me, this was a sign that their parents have instilled that important aspect into their hearts. See, these are children who are playing on the street. They know it's salah time, we're going to go to the masjid now. That conversation, that dialogue has to happen. So it is the parental responsibility to support and encourage those young people. And in addition to this, perhaps congregation in the houses when possible, and also attending functions for young people when they're happening. So look out for them and come along yourself with them, or encourage them to come. So this may go some way. It's not the full picture, it's part of the picture, it's part of the solution, inshallah. Ji.
I can see my son has some mental health issues, though don't know how to go about speaking to him, as this seems to be a taboo subject.
I can see that my son has some mental health issues, but I don't know how to go about speaking to him because this seems to be a taboo subject. Okay. It's something which I mentioned in the previous session, and perhaps on some other occasion as well. It's about instilling confidence in that relationship. So you don't necessarily have to bring it up directly. I talked earlier today about emotional intelligence, about being able to express your emotions. I'm going to go on a tangent here because for the general benefit. I think that there's a huge benefit in talking about emotions to young people. I'm talking about children, small children. I've had this conversation with my children in which you simply say, you say, look, how do you feel today? And they'll say, okay. And you say, find another word. Find another word. If they express a positive state of being, you ask them to tell you the opposites. If they tell you a negative state of being, you ask you to tell them the opposite. Okay, so what's another word for happy? Okay, excited perhaps? What's another word for sad? Irritable? Frustrated? So children have these words in their vocabulary. Small children do. But they never use those words. So if you talk about emotions, this expands their mental capacity to conceptualize emotions as well. So with your sort of older child, have conversations about other things. And the relationship should develop like a friend's relationship. So you can be free with each other, just become their age. Sympathize with them, and it's called mirroring, where you talk to somebody and you reflect their state of being. You stoop down to their level. It's a big subject actually. You can research this, but mirroring. So you mirror their language and their sort of kind of their tone, their state of being as much as you can. So they can start confiding in you. When you start having this conversation and they relax, you've made them more confident. Now what you can do is you're a bit safer in tentatively asking them how they feel, and you might be able to prise out of them their own feelings. That will give you a foundation for a further discussion. So it's about being able to talk to each other. I think this is a big aspect of this. I hope that answers part of the question, at least, inshallah. Ji.
Mullah Sahib, we're kind of running out of questions at a time, so we'll try and get another couple of questions in. Next one is, how do we keep teenage girls engaged in deen in the face of peer pressure, particularly when there's very few Islamic resources for sisters?
How can we keep teenage girls engaged in deen, especially in the face of peer pressure, when there are limited resources? Yeah, we'll have to create those resources as a community, as individuals. And this might be for your own children, it might be for a few others. So when and as possible in these current circumstances, why not use this question, this desire inside your heart as a foundation for finding a couple of other girls, a couple of other families in which there are girls of your own daughter's age, and arrange an activity for them in which they're performing some dini activity. And this need not be a burden, it can be very brief. See, deen. Out of the ulama that I have had the opportunity of meeting, we would have a guest here, Maulana Fidaur Rahman Darkhasti rahimahullah ta'ala. He passed away recently. He was a Shaykh al-Hadith in his madrasa, and he had a habit from his father, and I want to mention this. And his face was very radiant. People would talk about the nur on his face. What was his habit? In every single majlis, unabashed, he would always recite one verse of the Quran. He would ask someone to recite some Quran. So we have Zayd sitting here, Abdullah, read some Quran. If you only know Qul Huwallah, recite Qul Huwallah. If you know anywhere else, if you're Hafiz and a good Qari, do a full recitation. So he'd ask anybody to recite some Quran. 1 or 2 verses, 3, 4 verses. And then he himself would recite one single hadith and translate it. And he knew a lot of hadith to memory. And then they'd talk about other things. So he would always, subhanAllah, on the day of Qiyamah, he will have a unique record, inshallah. Because he did this all his life. This was his normal routine. So in order, your girls and their friends, they can get together for a bit of food, whatever it may be, and chat and have fun, but for a few focused moments. You say, come on girls, before we have this food now, let's talk for 5 minutes. And you just read something to them, or they read to each other. Amongst their, they can giggle and whatever in those moments. But if they get those words, do not underestimate ever the barakah and the potential results of even a few moments of a dini discussion, of taking the name of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So let's start that snowball rolling, inshallah. Ji.
Well, let's have a final question.
Ji.
This is from a mother.
Yeah.
What is the best approach to handling puberty with boys and ensuring they keep their passions under control and avoid pornography?
Dealing with puberty with boys, to keep their passions under control and avoid pornography. Yeah. It's about talking about this. It may be difficult for mothers if the father can't, and the father should. Often we find mothers are more particular about the upbringing of their children than the fathers. So this may be, now let's talk about this very briefly. See, there are some words which you can openly use. Children know what pornography is. If you want to know what children are aware of, it's not just about their peers or that studying that age group. It's also about what they talk about in school, in the curriculum. Parents ought to be aware of what is taught in the social and moral education at school. These subjects are all spoken about. Children know what pornography is at a very young age because it's part of their sort of education, it's part of the curriculum. You can openly say to your child the sin of watching pornography. You can say that. You don't have to go into the specifics because that's the embarrassing thing which makes you not want to talk about it. So you can use that word. About passions, you can use the word desires. You can talk about the word desires, but you don't have to talk about things in a very graphic way. So there's words that you can use which are appropriate. Shaykh Yunus rahimahullah ta'ala passed away recently. Shaykh al-Hadith, taught hadith for 50 years, renowned internationally. He mentioned once, he says, he was brought up in the subcontinent. He says, when I first came of age and I woke up needing a ghusl, he says, I changed my clothes and I was washing my trousers at the tap of the house. His father brought him up. He said, my mother passed away as a child. And he says, my father saw me in the morning washing my clothes. And he realized what had happened. And he came over to me and said in my ear, he says, Beta, he says, from now on, just remember to keep your thoughts pure. And he said it in one sentence. And that was his advice. Beta, now you need to keep your heart pure. So it doesn't have to be very complicated. But when it's never done, that's the problem. So this is one aspect. I have to be brief. One aspect is having that discussion. You don't have to be graphic. You can use particular words which are communicative, but they're not necessarily embarrassing. That degree of a discussion is not inappropriate. It's necessary. The second point is, how is your child passing their time? If you don't spend on them, in this day and age, in this day and age, I think that if you spend on entertainment, appropriate entertainment and holidays and trips for your children, this is sadaqah. If you do it to ensure that they're spending their time, it's better for your children to be playing football with appropriate friends than it is to be watching pornography on their tablet in their room. So take them out. You need to do it. Parents need to do it. You need to spend, you need to go out for picnics, barbecues, lockdown aside, when this time is, whatever is appropriate and safe at the moment, and when we don't have these restrictions, you need to do all of these things. So you need to do fun things with the children and spend on physical, whether it's toys or games of an appropriate sort, and then talk to your young people. Talk to them. And talk to your, and finally, this, again, I'm having to quickly summarize, talk to your adolescent children about marriage from now. And please, for the sake of Allah, for the sake of your children, for the sake of common sense, this idea that children are too young to get married at the age of 20 is absurd. It's got no relation to reality. Where do we live? In which cloud cuckoo land do we exist? So this is unfair. When Muslim children are told that when you're 28 and you've earned a little bit, you've saved up and bought a house, it's better to live in a flat with a halal lifestyle than it is to wait till you're 28 and your youth has been spent and you've perhaps made mistakes which you'll regret. So that's just another element. I hope these are some guidelines, some tips with reference to our discussion. I hope Allah Ta'ala I ask Allah Ta'ala to make our discussion beneficial, inshallah. I think we have to conclude now. May Allah accept. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alamin.